When I talk about happiness, I always go back to the science of it. So there's actually been data or research on what long-term sustainable happiness, not rainbows and unicorn happiness. So there's different forms. People say there's pleasure form, there's also passion form. Ultimately, the most sustainable form of happiness, as we found, is by being authentic to your true core of self and living a purposeful life.
Tell us what your definition of happiness is.
Well, way to dive into it. As we know, happiness is so subjective. Like everyone has their own form. So that's why when I talk about happiness, I always go back to the science of it. So there's actually been data or research on what happiness, long-term sustainable happiness, not rainbows and unicorn happiness. So there's different forms. People say there's pleasure form, there's also passion form. Ultimately, the most sustainable form of happiness, as we found, is by being authentic to your true core of self and living a purposeful life, having a purpose, being a part of something that's bigger than you. So that's what I go back to, is basically what does the data point to? And also historically thinking about where, what Aristotle and Socrates was talking about eons ago. It really actually started from that in the sense of having a sense of self, authentic self, and living a purposeful life.
That's great. And I'm sure you're familiar with, I forget the exact title, but I think it's the Harvard Men's Study on men that are happy. And I think it's the first longitudinal study of men from like 70 to 90, because people haven't lived that long. And so they found that the number one variable that not only is consistent, but must appear for people that are happy is what? Do you know what it is?
I think that study was based on, or the findings, I think it had to do with relationships, if I remember right.
Exactly. Of course. You're the expert. Of course. It's about relationships. And what's so interesting is that they could predict, when they did the study, they could predict who was going to be happy back to when the men were 50. And the relationships, and this is the Trust Doctor podcast, right? So it's all about relationships. The umbrella for every healthy relationship is trust. Without trust, you can't have a happy relationship with yourself. Now, you mentioned earlier the science of happiness. Can you talk to someone simple like me, like the ABC science behind happiness, what you see when you look at those brain scans?
Yeah. So when I say the science, and just a real quick point, though, what I really appreciated that you brought up about that study, it's not just the relationships with others. I think, especially in this time and age, it's the relationship with yourself.
1,000%.
Yeah. So,
well, and to your point, Jen, people say I'm searching for happiness. Well, happiness is an inside job. We're not happy within.
Yeah.
You can't be happy without. So thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Of course. So when I say science, it's basically because there's been decades of now research that has been done on, like basically from a social setting to, as you're saying, like a brain scan setting, physiological setting. So there's different forms of how we can say the science of. So I think a big part of, when we say the science of, we can point to the neuroscience that's most interesting to me is that when for example, they did a study of a monk, and basically because of his own state of being, in whether in meditation or his sense of happiness, a sense of peace, you can actually see through the scans of the parts of his brain that get lit
up.
In ways that that do not have a sense of peace of happiness or go in the states of meditation that basically don't get lit up. And there's other forms of science or data that shows that it actually is contagious. Happiness is contagious. If you're looking at me and I'm smiling, there are actually things firing in your neurons, firing in your brain that's actually wanting to basically make you want to smile too. And the opposite goes if someone's being sad or angry. So there's like all these little data points, and I love it in the sociological setting because of when you bring a sense of these elements of happiness, and there's a few that the science points to. It's a sense of control or autonomy. It's a sense of progress. So they are also growing and developing in life. It's a sense of connections. So what you're saying about the Harvard study, ultimately a sense of purpose. So what we found is that those 4 levers, as I call them, can increase people's happiness, as shown in the scientific studies of what can be done, not just in life, but in our workplaces, which is obviously something I'm really, really passionate about.
When COVID hit, right, that created a whole paradigm shift,
right,
both at home, inside people, in their hearts, in their minds, and in the workplace. How has your work seized on this paradigm shift to make changes for companies realizing that the happiness of their people matters? And corporate, of course, they care about the bottom line. So when you can show them the bottom line increasing parallel to happiness increasing, they're listening. But how do you implement that? What's the model that you bring in?
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to that question, which is also, I mean, so valid, especially right now. How I like to put it is like the world got 2020'd in a way that we could not. We actually predicted in different ways. Like futurists knew that there was going to be a recession, pandemic, climate change, social unrest. We just didn't know it was going to happen all in 1 year. And so for us, I just see it as a reset on humanity. What is it that when we wake up in the morning to the time we go to sleep, I think everyone started asking those questions. Am I really spending this time wisely? Am I really prioritizing
what am I doing
what's
with
most
my
important?
life?
Yeah, exactly.
It is there's so many wonderful things that came out where people really took the time to reevaluate how they live, how they work,
totally.
what they prioritize.
Yeah. So I think it, like my brother likes to say, let's not let a good pandemic go to waste. What did this do for us? And so there's like people that went to different sides of, hey, I want to go back to where I was, or the good old days. And there are those that understood that things will never go back to where it was. And so therefore, what am I going to do differently in my life? So specifically in the workplace, which is like what I'm really, what I'm passionate about is we saw that, we saw the great resignation and it's still happening. We saw the quiet quitting and it's still happening in its different forms. These all being symptoms of what was already under the hood. I believe just with 2020, it just basically lifted the hood and all things were laid to bear in a more honest and transparent way. So the things that we talk about now very openly, like burnout, like mental health, these kind of things we couldn't talk about 5-10 years ago, 4-letter words like love and care. We couldn't say those things in the workplace, but now we can. So I think for those leaders that actually, they went through it as well, whether CEO or a frontliner, we all went through this seismic shift of where we were before and now. And so I think those leaders that recognize that the future of work that we were talking about is actually in the present. We're living the future of work, remote, with hybrid, with automation, et cetera. So the notion that we as leaders at every level of leadership can understand that the human side of it is so much more important now, the humanizing work, essentially. If you do want to grow, if you do want to adapt, if you do want to become more profitable in this day and age, that human factor has to be part of the reframe, that they're not expenses anymore. They're actually assets. And if we reinvest in them, they'll reinvest in us as leaders of any organization.
Okay. So a couple of things that you touched on. So one is working moms since forever have been begging for remote work. Like if it's the type, like I can remember, I have 4 children. I can remember when they were younger, a kid gets sick, right? And when, like, I would have coached women back then, don't tell them that you're staying home because your kid's sick. Say you got a flat tire. This was before a cell phone where you could take a picture, right? Because it wasn't cool. Like you were supposed to be a worker and the rest of your life was nobody cared, like compartmentalize it. Right. And I think the great thing about remote work and Zoom is that, kids are running in behind people. People have on calls with their cat, their dogs are barking, and that was up and down the food chain. And I think it forced the human side of the person into the work because let's face it, we bring our whole selves to work.
Right.
But, we've been talking about mental health for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're talking about in terms of leaders caring. So we have now in the corporate world CSGs, right? Corporate social responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the company's way for many check the box. But when you talk to people that work there, I'm not so sure that check the box translates into what I'm going to call empathic leadership. So talk about that for a moment, if you can.
So yeah, the question about empathetic leadership, and you started this particular question around moms and how everything happened in 2020, really a big brunt of the responsibilities were assumed to be on them because they were doing it before, and they did studies of like showing couples of how the men would, gravitate towards the normal duties and household chores, but the women had to take on more because they had to homeschool and they had to basically on top of all their normal, everyday work that they had to do. So those added pressures, I think, was a big sort of wake up call to everyone as to, hey, now that work and life is more integrated than ever, we can step from our, office space in one room and then go to our life space with our kids in the next room over. I think that became a huge sort of spotlight as to the reality of what we are facing today as a society and in the workplace. So I think that ties into empathetic leadership, because I think those leaders that actually recognized how different a shift of our lives have actually endured and need to really change the fundamental ways of how we're doing work. That was a light bulb that if you are still continuing to realize you had to shift your life too as a leader, then the big thing about being empathetic is asking the right questions and actively listening to what's actually happening. And whether it's, working moms or maybe, what's going on with, challenges that fathers or, everyone has their own subjective things that went wrong or is very challenged by. So I think as leaders, we can be more empathetic of remembering what we had to go through in our own daily lives. And then also not assuming we know how to fix things to be more inclusive and to have these workplaces where people really want to show up and are not quiet quitting. I think the biggest thing is remember to be empathetic to yourself of what you went through and therefore ask the right questions, the active listening as how to address your particular workplace environment and teams.
Okay, so let me just play devil's advocate for a moment with that. Mm-hmm. So in terms of what you're describing with, both parents at home working, the research also shows that the man got the office, if there was an office, or they got the kitchen table, the woman got the closet. The woman was still doing, and I know for a fact women worked out of their closets.
Yeah, no, I'm laughing because there's a comic that has a woman and there's her son or daughter opening up the closet and said, "Oh, mom's in the conference or boardroom again." And so that's why I'm laughing because it totally was on point with that comic.
Exactly. And that the women did and this is not about a man or woman thing at all, mm-hmm. but that the woman took on more of the homeschooling, mm-hmm. percentage-wise, gross oversimplification than the man. Mm-hmm. And chances are, if we go through, as we're still in transition, many people in the leadership roles today are still men. Mm-hmm. And many of the people in the executive leadership role, where we mm-hmm. need the most empathic leadership, do not have wives, partners that are working full time. Mm-hmm. So they did not really experience the full brunt of somebody in a different situation. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that you can't be an empathic leader if True. You're already an empathic leader. Mm-hmm. But here's my pushback to you in terms of if the happiness really matters. Mm-hmm. First, the argument was you can't work from home because of productivity. And then mm-hmm. we found that, wow, productivity went through the roof. Mm-hmm. Then it was another one. And now it's the culture. And I feel every time you hear culture, just think control, because you can't create a culture, remote or hybrid. You can't create a model with the old model type of thing. Mm-hmm. And the push in some industries to drive people back into the office where it's now almost a full-time job to commute to and from work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you get to work, you're exhausted, right? Mm-hmm. Chances are, if you're in public transportation, you're working while you're going into work, you're working while you're coming back from work, right? Mm-hmm. Or you're on a conference call if you're driving. Mm-hmm. I don't see the happiness variable coming into play there. I'm feeling, wow, we're back to the profit. And now that the world seems to be so in flux, and I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I know not to open up my stock portfolio.
If you want to be happy, yeah.
Right.
So
one variable of that. So that's my concern. And how will you address that in your work? Like, I don't envy you.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think the biggest thing that I like as very valid questions, because the biggest things that we lost that impact our happiness, again, going back to the science, it's a sense of control. We lost a sense of control. We lost a sense of autonomy and being able to make decisions within our control. And we lost a sense of flexibility, or we gained it, depending how you look at it. So when the whole world loses those things, and then you get back to a place where it's either remote or hybrid or in the office, the biggest factor of happiness there is actually giving the sense of control back. So having flexibility as a working mom, as a working dad, to be able to choose what's best for him or her or they. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the biggest factors to remember here, because it's not a one size fits all answer. I've seen studies very recently where having that choice of hybrid and being able to, say when I'm coming in the office and not, increases happiness, so that they have that, you can retain that sense of control that we all lost. But I think a big thing to remember here as well, though, is that we need to zoom out as leaders. Like, these things of having better pay, flexibility, these are very, very important. But what we've been seeing, the best places to work right now with the most productive, engaged employees towards profitability are those that have a higher purpose. And I know this purpose word has been really tossed, a lot these days, more and more. But it truly is when someone shows up to work and doesn't just look at it's just another paycheck, or it's just another day at the job. And this can happen at all levels, not just at manager level. It can happen at frontliner level too, and we've seen it in the work that we've done. So I think we need to remember, like, we as human beings now are thinking about, like, why the Great Resignation? There was a Great Awakening. People were, as we were saying earlier, am I spending my life the way I want to, in the most meaningful way? So I think as leaders, on top of, whether you're making choices of remote, hybrid, et cetera, it's to remember that people are most connected and engaged and therefore happy when you have a sense of purpose for themselves, tied to that of the organization, tied to that of the mission of the company, beyond making more money. So I think those are things that we need to all remember as we go into this next phase.
So when you go into, so a couple of things. One is the purpose, right? I mean, Simon Sinek with "What's your why?" Like it's such a part of the vernacular, but I'm not so sure companies really live it, right? Like they'll have the mission, they'll have the purpose, they'll have the core values. But, the example that I always love to talk about is when President John Kennedy wanted to send a man to the moon, and he went down just into the Space Center, and there was a janitor.
Yeah, I love this story. Yes.
Right. Go ahead. You tell it. You'll tell it better than me.
I don't know. No, you were like going, you're riffing well. So,
okay. And he went around.
I love this story though.
And John Kennedy, of course, had such charisma, right? Yeah. And he said to the janitor sweeping the floor, he said something about, like, what's your job, or what are you doing here? And the man said, I'm the janitor. And he said, but I am part of the team that's putting a man on the moon. To me, that just encapsulates everything about the value of the purpose.
That higher purpose.
How you bring that. The man was a janitor. He was sweeping the floor. But it actually, every time I tell this story, it gives me goosebumps. It's incredible. It's really incredible.
It is, yeah.
And
it's sorry, go ahead.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So yeah, I have to say this because I love that story. At the same time, it hasn't been verified that it's actually true. So it's
the story.
The story, yeah.
How many stories are true?
Or based on some truth. But I've recounted that story as well because we actually see that in practice every day now. And I love the point of what you said. How many companies actually live according to not just their purpose statement or not just their mission, but their values? And I think that's also something that JFK was a huge part of why he was so successful in leading the country when he did, is that he brought it back to our values, our personal values, and that sense of higher purpose. So I have
greater than ourselves.
And ask not what you could do for, that whole, is that right?
That's not what you could do for you. What you could do for your country. Exactly.
And he was able to inspire with that versus now, if that was said, I don't know how people would take that in. So I think that just
in company, what about for companies?
And that's why I bring it back to companies. Yes. And this is why I'm so passionate about this work, because I think workplaces is when we ask ourselves, like, how can we create societal change for the better? I believe workplaces is a huge channel in which we can do that now. Like, I've been in companies that basically, because they live by their values, incentivized, reward, and recognized by them, therefore they're being lived, not just, worthless words on the wall. They actually feel they're living their own values and living a better life, therefore, and living a better life for themselves and the people they love. So it's kind of like this almost backdoor, Trojan horse way of essentially living better lives because the values are real and instilled and lived by in companies. So I see it as, one company at a time, one organization, one team at a time. When they live more meaningfully with alignment with purpose and values, that in effect is how we're creating positive change in society and how we interact with ourselves and each other.
Now, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to this movement, to getting companies to buy into you, what you call the ROI, the ripple on impact, which I love, absolutely love?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's I call it a double ROI. So there's the return on investment, the traditional one. And we've seen over the last 15 years for those places, those companies that double down on their people, they consistently outperform the S&P 500, even in bad economic times, and something that we're enduring now. So in that sense, so there's that we know. So that's just in the data. And then the other side of it is that ripple of impact. That's the double ROI. And the ripple of impact happens when we can actually instill these things so that every single person is showing up as authentic to themselves, living according to their purpose and values, all the things that we're talking about in scientific happiness, and able to align that with the organization. If every person is showing up that way, that in effect is actually authentically living out the higher purpose of the company, because people are living out their internal purpose within themselves, rippling that impact to the team, and therefore that of the company and their customers and their partners and vendors in an authentic way, everyone that they touch in their ecosystem. So I think the beauty of what we have right now is that more and more leaders are seeing that profits can coexist, if not be bolstered, by having purposeful, authentic leaders within the company. That level of coexistence, I don't think we've seen that much before. But those leaders that are progressive enough to see that they are actually correlated directly between profits and the ability to grow through their people, I think those are the ones that actually are ready and well positioned to endure. We still have a lot of hardships that are coming.
Okay, so here's a really tough question for you.
Okay, love it.
So we all know there are so many people that don't have a clue as to who they are and their authentic self.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, one thing I always say, I'm not in the business of twisting people's arms to be happy. That's just not going to be done.
I will not make you happy.
Nor am I able to, twist someone's arm to be authentic to themselves. But I think what the best.
But seriously, Jen, I'm talking about they want to be. They just don't know how.
That's right. So that's what I'm really big about is the how piece, because we can talk about this philosophically. We could talk about this like till kingdom come in all these different ways. The how comes back to, and we try to break it down as like practically as we can. If they want to, then there comes a sense of, are you curious enough to try and implement these things in your life to find that sense of authenticity? So for us, we go to our model.
I love it. I love the word you used. I'm sorry, but curious. It's curiosity. That's where all growth lies. Go ahead.
Thank you. Because I think that when we have that sense of curiosity, then we're willing to explore. We're willing to test things out that maybe others might, because they just want to be, back in the good old days, or maybe a little bit too fearful of what change could happen. But when we actually embrace that there will be change around us, and the most that we can actually do is adapt and control what we can within us with that sense of curiosity, then we can start testing things of what actually adds to my well-being, what actually might be my purpose statement, not making it a huge daunting thing, but what might I want to do to impact, not the world. Like sometimes that's just too big. How do I want to impact my world and the people that I touch and people that I love? So I think if people are willing to do the work, and this is the most important work, is not the work you get paid for. It's the work within yourself. Like you mentioned this earlier. Are we willing to look into our past? I call it be an archaeologist in our past, our highs and our lows, because happiness is not just defined by our highs. It's actually really defined by our lows, what we went through, how we got out of it. And those are sometimes even bigger achievements than what we classify as success in typical society. So when we do that archaeology within our reflections, we understand ourselves better. What are our values? Like for me, is authenticity, it's having a sense of freedom and meaningful relationships. Like I figured that out over the years of like, what is the most important things to me and how I want to live my life that way. So I think with that sense of curiosity, being able to make, draw lines in the sand of like, maybe this might be my purpose. I'll test this out. And maybe it might not be, but at least I'm exploring. I'll know what I want to do more. And I'll obviously know what I don't want to do anymore.
So it sounds like you're creating, this is a term that's so overused too, but I mean it sincerely. You're creating a safe space for somebody to be willing to, you use the word curiosity, which is just like gold, right? Like just allow yourself to be curious, because there's no judgment there. You're not attached to any outcome, right? And then when, the growth happens when you get out of your comfort zone. So, you said a couple of times in so many words going back, people want to go back to the good old days. They weren't so good. And there's never, and there's very few absolutes in life, right, Jen? But there's never going back. Yeah. And if you keep looking behind you, you're going to keep hitting your head against the next wall. Yeah. Right? So the opportunity comes in the curiosity if you can get comfortable being uncomfortable. Right. So now that leads me to this question for you.
Okay. And I do want to make a note on safety though, but I'm going to go with the question.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah. Please hold that question. It sounded like a good one by the look on your face.
I hope so.
You brought up safety, and this term is really being used in a bigger way now in the sense of psychological safety. What we are really doing is providing the space and psychological safety to not be judged, to not be reprimanded, to not be fired because you're expressing yourself. And there's a really important study I want to mention that's called the Aristotle study. Aristotle's coming up again, that Google did. And basically longitudinal study, I think it was 30,000 something employees over a year's time. And they wanted to find out, number one, what makes the most effective teams in Google. And you would have thought it was, it was their manager or maybe their software, but it wasn't those things at all. They realized that it was psychological safety for those teams, that they were the most productive and effective. And so you think about that, we can do that to make effective teams, but we also want to do that in a way we can have more effective people individually with a sense of, greater self. and authenticity to that. But anyway, I just want to mention psychological safety, how important that is right now.
Oh, and absolutely. And I did mean the psychological safety, but I didn't clarify that. So thank you for that. And if you think about it, especially for a place like Google, but really any company, if you're not innovating, you're going to be dead in, by the time this podcast is over, right? The only way you can innovate is if you fail. Mm-hmm. And the only way you will allow the safety of failure is for people to be feeling they're not going to get fired when they fail, right? You fail fast, you fail forward. There's a whole model around that. But you have to feel that you're safe. You're in a safe place to fail. Mm-hmm. So let me see if I can create some kind of a great transition here, which I probably won't. But what you said earlier about the authentic self and the leadership and being, employees that are happy where they work. Mm-hmm. I feel this is also, we're going to hear a lot more about this because this is what I'm seeing in my coaching and consulting. Mm-hmm. People have to feel trust. Mm-hmm. They have to trust that the team, the manager, the company trust them. Mm-hmm. And of course, they have to be trustworthy.
Right.
You never heard about the concept of trust before. And before it used to be command and control. That's what it was. Now it's trust and inspire. Mm-hmm. So how does that concept play into the model and what you're creating with going into companies where you're inspiring the leaders to help foster an environment that I guess creates, nurtures, and sustains happiness, which is the individual's responsibility, but it can only happen within a certain environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a great segue.
Okay, thank you.
And because this is a psychologically safe place to do this. So I think the biggest thing, and you said it in a way with the word nurture. And I talk about this in my book, and I call it the model we've used in the past is actually expanded on now because of all the things that happened in the last couple of years. So it's not just, in my book is called Beyond Happiness for a reason, because it's not just about happiness anymore. My belief system is that it's beyond that because it's about those highs and lows. It's about living, not necessarily, but by the time you wake up and the time you go to sleep, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, that you're happy, because that's just not, that's not possible. There's just no way you can be happy every second of the day, but you can be fulfilled. You can know with confidence that you've lived according to your values, you lived according to what your higher purpose might be. So along those lines, like being able to nurture in the way that you're talking about, I think is the key to something that everyone wants. Like what, beyond happiness, what is it that people want in life is like to be the ability to actually grow and have that nurturing sense of the greenhouse model, and being able to say, look, if I am trying to nurture others, how can at the same time, and something that we forget as leaders in all levels of life, how do I nurture my own greenhouse too?
Okay, so let me interrupt you, because there might be one person listening to this podcast that hasn't heard about the greenhouse model. So please tell us what that is.
Yeah. So
for that one person, just that one person that hasn't gotten the book yet.
Right. No, totally. So the greenhouse model is like an analogy that we've had for leadership for a long time. And this is something that I used to talk to my co-founder with, is that as leaders, we want to create the environment conditions of a greenhouse so that we don't have to be the tallest tree or the biggest plant, but we are creating the conditions for others to grow. And so I believed in that for a long time. But what I did not realize was that there was a gap, there was a missing link there. And the build to that was like, yes, of course we want to take care of others. Of course we want to grow others. But the biggest gap was who's taking care of ourselves. So nurturing others, yes, but how can we nurture our greenhouse at the same time? And so it's like the whole, the oxygen mask analogy, going back to the plane thing. And I think we forgot over the years. And maybe it's because we didn't fly for many, like 2.5 years now. So we forgot that as counterintuitive as it is to put on that oxygen mask first. That's the whole point of the greenhouse model, is like, make sure you're doing the work and being curious of how to nurture your own, because it's not, formulaic. It's basically being able to test what are the things that will actually fill me up when I'm depleted, and be able to like say, well, just because someone's saying meditation is great, or, taking a walk or whatever it is, it's like, no, what is great and most aligned with who you are and how you can nurture your greenhouse. So that's where that comes from.
So you're talking about self-care. And I have to tell you this funny story. Here's an absolute coaching faux pas all right, it was a long time ago, so I've gotten much better. But a woman was struggling with this, taking care of herself, right? Taking care of everybody, a little bit of the martyr syndrome.
Yeah.
I like to work out. I'm a little bit of an athlete. So I'm like, listen, why don't you go for a walk, take a run or whatever? And she's looking at me like, this is going over like a lead balloon. And I'm saying like, wow, what's going on? She goes, I hate exercise, but I love to knit. I said, okay. but to your point, I was I wasn't aligned with what she saw as self-care. So what you're saying is right there, right on the money.
Yeah. So that's, I think, a big next level up of self-awareness in understanding like, hey, is this really aligned with who I am? And then going back to your comment about trust, I think that has slowly been a bigger, a bigger factor to the bigger equation. But I think there's newer things on top of trust, or together with trust, that's really important in this day and age of how we design our companies, how we design our organizations. And this is all part of the greenhouse model that I talk about in the book. So in addition, there's a sense of accountability. So not in the big brother, big sister kind of way, but one of the conditions we need to have within these greenhouses, within our organizations, is, hey, I got your back and I got yours. That's the level of trust that I'm talking about, so that everyone has this very clear role and they understand why they're there, and be able to say, okay, we can trust each other that we're going to do this. But beyond that now is not just that trust and accountability, is also belonging. And this has been big with, diversity and inclusion. Yeah. And I think that's a sense like, maybe this is the word of this time, but that sense of belonging where everyone can feel heard and understood is really big in this sense of greenhouses that we're trying to nurture and grow now. And then the last thing is, you also mentioned too, last greenhouse condition I'll talk about right now is alignment. How can you find that alignment first within yourself in the authentic core, and then align the values, the purpose with that of everyone in your team? Imagine how much more effective your teams are when people understand each other's values, understand each other's purpose, and that ripples its impact to the organization as a whole.
This is great. Here's another question that's not fair.
Okay.
Everything you just described suggests that there's no office politics. So, humans being what they are. Yeah, that's right? True. So I don't know. Is there a little bit? Do you seek it out and crush it? Like, what do you do with that? And quite frankly, the higher up the company you go, sometimes it seems more brutal.
Totally. And I've been in all these different kind of environments where it is like really, really difficult. And especially, for those that don't have a say. But I guess part of what I've learned over the years is that it's unfortunately a default assumption that politics will exist. And when we accept that politics will always be there, what are the conditions that will accept it to? Like, to what level? And that's why I'm such a big believer in values, because even if there's that political relationship or dynamic that's happening, if they're actually living by those values, you can call that out in a safe space, psychological safety speaking. If you're truly living by, your values and purpose, then you can call that out. This is a violation of this value, and these are the reasons why. And if it's an environment that lives by the values, that's one route of, the outcome. If it isn't, then it's a huge indicator. Maybe I'm not in the right team. Maybe like, because sometimes like you look at the Googles, you look at the companies that are on the best places to work. I guarantee you talk to any one of those companies and people within, there's going to be unhappy people. There's just no doubt, there's just no way around it.
Right.
The biggest question then for ourselves as individuals is like, how do I know myself better, therefore ask the right questions to be within the right team in my company, even if I'm not aligned with, what others might be thinking outside of it. So I think those more like, less drastic maneuvers of just, scary right now, inflation, and we've got this looming recession. Most people don't want to quit. And that's why this quiet quitting came about. But I think if we can align ourselves within those smaller communities, smaller teams, that has a sense of common values. I think that's really the most practical and best way to make our lives happier, more content, and more at peace.
Yeah, I mean, I love everything you said. Just a couple of comments. You can put some people in nirvana and they'll be miserable, right? So you're always going to find miserable people.
Yeah.
My experience has been, and I'd like to know what you think about this, is that, with this. So I think there's an expression where there's people, there's politics. It's almost human nature. Aristotle would agree with that, right? If we go back to the Greeks, right? They practically, oh gosh, I don't want to get in trouble, but they sort of kind of created democracy, and it's all about debate and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think the toxic part, that if you want to create a happy environment and any good culture is, and this has been my experience, zero tolerance for gossip. Right now, there's gossip and there's gossip. Those shoes are horrible. Although it can be a slippery slope, is very different than did you hear about? Yeah. And it's Machiavellian, or it's with malfeasance or whatever.
Yeah.
That I think maybe it are different boundaries. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, then it's funny, timing wise, is I think I read it maybe last week. The value of gossip and the reason why it's so powerful is like, because if stated in a gossip form, it's that much more impactful in terms of what that message is in a storytelling way. Unfortunately, it's kind of like media, right? Like, why do people want to hear bad news? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I did read that article, and they were trying to find a positive side to gossip.
Yeah.
I felt that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was interesting to me that it's brought up in that way. Or like, I think it was an HBR actually, but
it was a reframing. It was a
reframe. And so I think that for me, it still goes back to storytelling. For me, it still goes back to, if we can create those more consistent environments that actually live by their values, we can call out whether is this a piece of information that's actually helpful, not just to me, but helpful for all. And that's a big question. I think 2 questions that if we can answer, what's in this for me, and what's in this for all, in especially these big decisions that we're all making, that to me has a better chance of creating a culture of, purposeful culture of belonging.
And I think the good news is, I could say a lot not good about the younger generations, but I think they are mandating this happiness factor at work. And I think it's great that you're giving it a structure to it, right? They're not wrong. They also saw that parents work for a company, in that 20 years you get a pension, and at 19 they got fired. And it felt deliberate, so I give them credit for that. In terms of the quiet quitting, though, and I'm someone that, probably works too much, like my work, I'm old school work ethic, right? Not good, not bad. But I will say there was a time where we didn't have the internet and we didn't have a cell phone. There was a time if the boss called you on the weekend, it was like, oh my God, like there were hours, there was structure, and that was for the hard driving, ambitious person. Yeah. So the work-life boundary has blurred with, technology. There is something to be said for, I don't have to be on call 24/7.
Right.
I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there, and I am someone, you over deliver, you go-to person, you work hard, but to have to be on call 24/7, unless you're a neurosurgeon and you're on call.
Mm-hmm.
No, I do think it's doing a reset back to, to be happy. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
the expectations have to be shifted a little bit.
Yeah.
How does this conversation work in your work?
So the latest data that I've been seeing in expectations has been, so essentially like it's just not just the workers, like not just the younger generations, we're seeing it across the board. So like, as an example, with quiet quitting, it was, TikTok born, but what was interesting is that those that engaged with it was it was cross-generational.
Mm-hmm.
It was also baby boomers. It was also Gen Xers.
I do think though that the younger people gave voice to, and they're like, yeah, we feel the same way. So I do think I'll give them credit. I think they led the charge verbalizing it.
Yeah, externalizing it, and people saying, oh yeah, that's me too. And so what I saw in that was interesting is that the expectation of happiness has increased across all generations of leaders. The expectation of also well-being has increased across all generations and leaders. And so these things that have been kind of, come to bear again is that what is this data point that I'm about to show is interesting to me is that even CEOs are saying well-being is more important than their own career track, like their own traditional career path. But there's a gap between what CEOs think in terms of how they're prioritizing well-being in their place of work, in their workplace, versus the perception of what employees are feeling, that it's not being prioritized, yet the CEOs think it's being prioritized. So I guess to me, all these indicators, like the expectations have shifted. And why I'm really big about this level of authenticity and self-awareness is like, as leaders, because this has shifted and is never going back to, where we're in the past, and whether it's an environment that says no emails on weekends, no calls on weekends, that's still also, that's always going to be basically the prerogative of that leader. Mm-hmm. The question then becomes, do we want to be a part of it? Because there are cultures like Apple, for example, they're pretty hard driving and at one of the most successful companies in the world. Do I choose to be in that culture? Because I know I'm going to get a weekend call and I have to love it or else I'm not going to be here. Mm-hmm. So that's a choice that I think with this great awakening resignation that we all need to make.
So to bring it full circle, so if you make that choice, that's aligned with your value, and that will not impact, that will not negate your happiness, because it all goes back to the choice and the flexibility.
Yes, you've made that choice, like because of an intentional place within you, versus someone imposing it on you. That sense of authentic to your core of values is a big essence of happiness within our
control over your life.
Exactly.
It's one of the reasons I became an entrepreneur. I'm like, I'm not going to work hard to make somebody else rich. It absolutely made no sense to me.
That was me too. I became an entrepreneur after I got laid off after the first .com bust. I'm like, wait, I worked my ass off and I just got laid off. What is not feeling good here?
Well, and then also I had 4 children, and I'm like, the best boss in the world isn't going to let me raise my children the way I want to raise my children. Like, I know I'll get my job done, but I might not get it done on his term or her terms. Yeah. So I'm like, we need to find a different path.
That's a great point.
What's the relationship between resilience and happiness? Right? Because you said happiness is not just defined when we're happy, right? Was it? I might be dating myself, but remember the singer Jim Croce?
I'm
dating myself.
I mean, it sounds really familiar. Wait,
he was killed in a plane. He was killed in a plane crash in Denver. I think. Okay. Oh no, that might have been somebody else. Anyway, he had a song that said, "Nobody's ever had the rainbow, baby, until they've had the rain."
Okay. And
that came to mind when you were talking about the happiness isn't just a one-way street, right? So
resilience.
About the resilience.
Yeah, I think it's a huge part of it. And it's really alluding to what I'm saying in Beyond Happiness. It's that like people feel like they need to keep on chasing those highs and think that's equivalent to their happiness. But it really is by understanding when we actually look at the things, for example, that we endured in the past, like our lowest lows, this is part of the exercises that we do in our work. It's called Happiness Heartbeats. So if you were to think about one of your lowest lows, like for me, it was all within 1 year, I got laid off, 9/11 happened, and we found out my dad had stage 3 colon cancer, and he eventually passed not too long thereafter. So that's definitely one of my biggest lows in life. But then if I'm able to actually map what was the high after that, I'm able to see what got me through those times where I felt like I had no idea how to pull myself out of that hole. And so that's where the resilience comes in. It's like being able to identify, look back and reflect and identify, that's where I built that piece of resilience. And therefore, I know, even though I'm in a hole again, I'm capable of doing it again. So I think it's part of that gamut in that song by, is it Jim Croce? Of being able to know. It's not cliche. It's like, you got to know your lows. And if you want to know your truest highs, then you got to know your lowest lows. And I think that's a big part of being that resilient, of learning that your own resilience in your own way, not what's being forced on you.
Right. So for the listeners, because I'm sure people will be thinking, okay, so you have this company that's like one of the fastest growing companies of Fortune 5,000 list of the fastest growing companies, right? And you started this work back with the founder of Zappos, right? Mm-hmm. Tony Hsieh,
the CEO, yeah.
Right. And, he came to a tragic, his life wasn't so happy, although it seemed as if he was living a happy dream. How have you, as someone that I imagine was friends with him besides just a business associate, how do you reconcile that for yourself?
Yeah, that's a big question that he passed at the end of 2020. And just a quick correction is that we're one of the fastest growing on Inc. 5000 list.
Oh, okay. Excuse me.
So
I should look my glasses on.
So just to put in context, Tony passed November 2020, and I had, it was unexpected. And I had 5 weeks till the book was due. And it was like crazy time. And I had to process, and I had to finish the book, and I had to understand what, not just in the context of his passing, but also in the context of what I was trying to say in this book. So part of that processing was a realization, and this is a big thing about the greenhouse metaphor, because Tony and I talked about that in the past. But I think the greatest build for me there was that piece that was missing of perhaps we're not nurturing our own greenhouse enough because we're so busy and so passionate and so purposeful in building other greenhouses and nurturing others. So that's how, it's, almost been 2 years now that I've come to a better sense of peace, is that there was no irony, there was no conflict in that he wasn't living truly to his purpose. He really wanted to deliver happiness, and he did in so many ways. And I think there was some things I might, through that, have had a bit of an oversight in his own nurturing of his own true greenhouse.
Well, and thank you for sharing that, because I can feel, I can feel the emotion, and in it, to be true, just being a human, so much of what our passion for what we share with the world many times reflects what we're lacking for ourselves. And sometimes it's just easier to give to others, which is why your whole concept of the greenhouse is so relevant and so poignant in the situation. And many people do struggle with that, So it's so important that we have the self-care, as long as it's attached to something greater than ourselves. And I think, that you tie all that stuff beautifully together. So just 2 more questions, because I want to respect your time, although I could talk to you all day. Like, who doesn't want to talk about happiness? Like, really? What's the last book you reread, and why?
Oh, interesting. I would say actually is because it was just a month ago, and it's Will Schwabe. He was our editor for Delivering Happiness, the book, and it's called End of Your Life Book Club. And so he's a lover of books, and he talks about all these different books, but he does it in his way where he shares the experience of his last moments with his mom that was going through chemotherapy and passed away with, I think it was cancer for sure, but like how he did it. And I interviewed him recently just because he really likes to think about life and death, and he does it through books. So it's just a beautiful journey of how every time he would visit her during her appointments for chemotherapy appointments, etc., they would talk about another book. And so it's kind of like this celebration of book and the value of books, and a celebration of their relationship. Even when there was a quote in there from her, says, I still want to live while I'm dying. Something to that effect of like how important these moments can be. So anyway, that's the last book that I reread. And it's just really impacted me because I lost my dad, and just reading that now versus then, which was 10 years ago. I lost my dad 20 years ago, read the book 10 years ago. And now it's like, wow, it's actually really cool to see how we have still the same person inside, but how much maybe our reflections and our reframing of life has grown and adapted over the years.
Yeah, it sounds like it's nurturing your soul. And that is what's interesting about books. Like you read a book when you're at every different stage of your life, there's a common denominator, but you're a different person just from life experiences. So thank you for sharing that. And then what's the one song you could not live without?
Wow. Those, like, what is your favorite XYZ? It's so hard for me because it's just so circumstantial.
Well, at this moment in time, this is where we are.
For some reason, one that's okay. This one, there's two that's popped in. There's one by the Beatles, and I don't remember the names, but there are places that I remember.
Wow, I thought you were going to say that when you just said the Beatles. So you just blew my mind.
No way, really?
Yes, I did. I was singing it to myself, but I can't sing for anything. So you don't
that's why I didn't sing it.
All my life, but some have changed, some together, not. In my own life, I love you more. Maybe love you more. Loved you more. Mm-hmm.
I think it's either that or In My Life, actually. Yeah, that one's is always, it's transcended every phase of my life through. It kept, it has been a constant thread, but it's always really cool to see how different I am now versus when I first heard it, or, when I was breaking up with someone or stuff like that. So that's probably the one that's popping in my head most.
Great. And are you happy?
I am happy in the sense I'm living as much of a fulfilling life that I can never imagine, and I've learned a lot about embracing those lows, especially in the last 2.5 years, and understanding the gamut of how low I can be, and therefore how much more elevated and high I can be as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So tell the listeners where they can find out more about you, how they can get Delivering Happiness, how you would like them to reach out to you in any way.
Yeah, so I have a website I launched with the book Beyond Happiness, and it's just Jenn Lim, my name, JENNLIM.com. And then we still have the company, deliveringhappiness.com. Those are the ways. If you want to reach out, give me a shout, ask any questions, tell me what makes you happy. I'm all for that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, happiness, it's what it's all about.
You.
So thank you.
Can I ask if you're happy?
Oh, yes, I am. I am. But, like you said, it's a little bit like a sine wave,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
heartbeats.
Right. There's moments where for me, I think if you're grateful for what you have, you'll be happy. Because there'll always be people that have more. There'll always be people that have less. But happiness is being content with what you have, which doesn't mean that you can't strive for more. But if there's always something you need, like there's so much that we need, but there's very few things that we want. And for me, it's all rooted in relationships. Like you could have $1 gazillion, and if you're alone in the hill in the mansion on the hill,
yeah,
what good is it? What good is it? So, but thank you for asking. Thank you for asking.